upon a system of cooperative effort, a system that would cease to function if communication among team members is not really facilitated on a day-to-day basis, if it's not analyzed when tensions begin to arise, and if it's not adapted to the needs of each of the team's individuals. In Barnard's view, there are really three crucial ingredients for managing this tension: common purpose, cooperation, and once again, communication. The interdependence of these three ingredients cannot be underestimated. Without clear, effective, and frequent communication, team members often individualize the team's purpose to an extent to which that their perspective interrupts or contradicts the team purpose. In this way, the team purpose becomes secondary. The individual motivations overrule or contradict the team purpose. And the team purpose often deteriorates in ways that negatively influence the team's cooperative efforts. In essence, the cooperative efforts of a team greatly depend on managing the multiple personalities that all of us bring to teamwork. Now, when we look at the ideal team model, which is further detailed in your print package, we see purpose represented, along with goals, roles, structures and procedures, interpersonal compatibility, and understanding as the dimensions of teams that must be combined with leadership and competent employees. But what we don't necessarily understand from this ideal team model is this tension that Barnard's been talking about. Nor do we see the individual communication patterns that can work to facilitate or constrain the accomplishment of this ideal team. Essentially, efforts of a team to achieve common objective, to enjoy their work together, or to produce quality products may be restricted by communication problems. The problems that can develop in attempting to build teams can actually be sorted into three domains. First, substantive problems. Second, procedural problems. Third, relational problems. Now let's take a look at each of these three domains and the strategic communication that might be utilized to address each of these problems. Team building can be hindered by substantive problems when information is insufficient, incomplete, inadequate, biased, or even of limited relevance. Substantive problems also can develop when teams run into difficulty in deciding how to use the information that they have gathered. Substantive problems are best addressed when individual members of the team take responsibility for playing what is termed a facilitator role at various points throughout the team's interaction. Performing this facilitator role means communicating in ways that help teams work together. They work together to develop and apply criteria for evaluating the information that they collect. Playing the devil's advocate role, group members can facilitate a reflective thinking process where information evaluation becomes a norm. And team members learn to just expect each other to be vigilant about playing the facilitator role. The principle of equifinality suggests that there are many paths to the same end, that there's no best procedure for a team to follow in accomplishing its objectives. In addition, what we know is that individuals vary in both their needs and preferences for procedural order. But without a doubt, procedural problems frequently become the culprit in counteracting or constraining the team building process. 6 of the most frequent procedural problems include the following. First, the tendency of members to introduce irrelevant discussion. That happens all the time. Second, members become impatient with a perceived lack of progress. Too much time spent on one part of the agenda. Third, moving through an agenda without the group having received closure on important items. So at the same time you can move on too quickly, you can also spend too much time on an item. Fourth, to be highly restricted in their efforts to identify alternatives. This is kind of a closed-mindedness that the group has that makes it difficult to entertain creative and innovative ideas. Fifth, to avoid formalizing the criteria the group will use to assess the merits of alternative choices. One time the criteria is this, the next time the criteria is something else, and it becomes very frustrating. Sixth, the inconsistent application of criteria to selected choices. Very crucial in the team building process. Procedural problems are best addressed, once again, like substantive problems, if team members share together in playing a facilitator role. Recognizing that for any given task, there exists a limited number of paths to the same end, facilitators would work to communicate with other team members to gain knowledge of what finite sets of paths the team has open to them for this particular task that they are working on. Now, equipped with this knowledge, facilitators would communicate with the members to keep them traversing just one of the possible and realistic paths. The facilitator communicates to combat and overcome disruptions that create procedural problems. Now, while substantive and procedural problems often constrain the team building process, it is really the relational problems that seem to cause most of the difficulties in teams. I'm sure many of you can attest to that. Relational problems typically center on a pressure for uniformity, authority relations, status differences, and a variety of other conflicts that are really related to the incompatibility of the team and individual goals, what Barnard was talking about earlier. Now, one of the greatest difficulties in addressing relational problems is balancing these efforts to try to solve these relational problems while at the same time working to make appropriate decisions and reach the best solutions regarding the task at hand. Too often, one or the other wins out in ways that can be very destructive to the team building efforts. People become frustrated because we keep talking about the relational problems, or people become frustrated because we don't address those and we keep moving on. So, critical to addressing relational problems, once again, is the facilitator role that any and all members of the team can play at any time. When addressing relational problems, the facilitator must draw on the range of communication strategies to select the approach that matches the relational problem faced. And it is imperative that team members be attentive to certain situations which require them to join someone else who is playing the facilitator role and communicate the problem in a way that does not place any members of the group or the team on the defensive. Clearly, the minimization of relational problems can create a climate in which the substantive and procedural aspects of a task can be pursued more easily. But as many of you know already, relational problems abound in teams, and the only way that we can create effective teams that display many of the characteristics and traits that Dr. Torres discussed earlier is to identify these problems and develop communication strategies for managing and overcoming the problems. I'd like to turn our attention now to one dysfunctional relational problem and the related strategies for addressing this problem. I'd like to point out that you may not have experienced this complete problem as I describe it, but maybe some aspect of it. so you may be able to relate to part of what I'm discussing, but maybe not the whole package. All too often, the myth of teamwork operates in organizations. We strongly believe, in the capability of groups to accomplish more and accomplish it better than individuals. However, we know all too well that team experiences can be frustrating and unproductive. I face this all the time in my college teaching, where students don't want to work in the group. They want to work individually because they don't want to manage these relational problems, these dysfunctional dynamics. Cynthia Stoll and Susan Schell, who are communication researchers, describe one such experience in their research that's published in the journal Management Communication Quarterly. I will be reporting the results of their research, which I feel is a vivid example of just one dysfunctional dynamic that often develops in teams. They describe how often the dysfunctional dynamic operating is that the team becomes dominated and derailed by one person. Even when tasks are accomplished, team members are left frustrated and exhausted, often even demoralized, and sometimes downright angry. I'd like to report to you a conversation that reveals the dysfunctional dynamic, which they call the team bully. When asked about his recent promotion, a sales manager for a large agricultural business captured the sense of frustration and helplessness that people often feel when having to deal with a particularly problematic group member. Larry says, "When I got my promotion, I was real pleased, and still am, except one thing, the Thursday meetings. They're impossible. They wouldn't be if John weren't there, but he is. In fact, he's everywhere. The rest of us get upset just thinking about having to face him in the morning." Cynthia says, "If so many are upset, why do you tolerate him?" Larry says, "Well, he's a great salesman, and that's what sells the guys on top, so we need him. Although, honestly, I'm sure we'd do better without him." Cynthia says, "Well, what sorts of things go on at the Thursday meeting that are so upsetting to you and others?" Larry says, "Oh, it's really hard to explain. But he runs the meeting. Even though Al does, John somehow does. We're talking about something, and John just has to butt in and give us his ideas, as if there was no doubt that we should all agree. Really, it's like he's a bully. But we never really violent, but just intense-like. He really gets me upset." Now, this conversation is a vivid portrayal of the organizational bully, and it reveals how one individual can subvert a potentially effective team meeting. Even though you may have never experienced this exact scenario, more than likely you have experienced something similar. In fact, maybe at some point in time you actually played the role of the team bully. Now, this type of team exhibits a specific constellation of dysfunctional processes. So the question becomes, how does this dysfunctional dynamic take shape? This dysfunction cannot be located with any one individual or even one particular team meeting. Rather, the problem is enacted over time in a variety of contexts with multiple actors. It is the composite experience of the group members that makes the dynamic so troublesome. We'd like to just blame this individual, but we can't. The dynamic begins with team members' anticipation of their meetings. Now, prior to the meeting, some members begin to become anxious. Their stomachs begin to tighten. They begin to look for reasons to skip the meeting. And most anticipate some really unpleasant interactions. Some members may even begin to theorize about themselves what he or she is going to do this week. They begin to strategize, but become frustrated knowing that whatever they try, it will be perverted and used against them in some way. They therefore resign themselves to the inevitable. Now, the dynamic continues during the actual team meetings. Some members tend to think more about the problematic individual than the topic at hand. Ideas such as the following might cross their mind. If you know so much, why aren't you in charge? Or, this is none of his business. Or, why doesn't someone shut him up? Or, here we go again, I'm out of here. Now the dynamic continues after the meetings, when frustrated members often congregate in the hallway outside the meeting, in their offices, the nearest bar, and they're all bemoaning what went on. They blame themselves, they blame others for not doing anything, but they're unable to come up with some realistic solutions to their problems. Now, as you can see, team members are almost consumed with the actions of this one specific individual. But in actuality, the problem isn't just this one individual, it's actually a team problem. Indeed, this focal individual's dysfunctional behavior depends upon the team members' willingness to play according to organizational and cultural rules, such as standards of courtesy, being polite, disclosure, not wanting to say anything for fear to rock the boat. At the same time, the team members may be demeaning and distancing themselves from the individual. The team members, ironically, find themselves incorporating the terminology, the worldview, and even some of the behaviors of the member that they find offensive. This team dynamic is referred to as the organizational farrago. Now, farrago literally means mixed fodder for cattle, but figuratively it's used to describe a medley, a conglomeration, or a confused group. The focal individual in this team dynamic is called a farrago for two reasons. First, interactions with this type of problematic person often result in confusion as to responsibilities, group tasks, decision-making, or procedures. And second, these interactions themselves cause the group to become such a confused mixture. The term farrago, therefore, is able to represent both the individual role and, importantly, the team's interactive system. So, the question becomes, what communication does the farrago display? A communication profile of the farrago includes the following four characteristics. First, the farrago creates crises. He or she suggests that the issues have a pressing, urgent need for action. Anything that the farrago is interested in takes on inflated importance. And anything he or she is not interested in is portrayed as trivial. Second, the farrago has what is termed interpretive omnipotence. The individual communicates a sense that there is but one appropriate, correct interpretation of social life, and that he or she has privilege claim to it. Phrases such as, any reasonable person can see, or the facts clearly indicate, are the kinds of things that the farrago says. Third, the farrago takes what's termed a heroic stance. The individual assumes a paternal posture toward the team and frames his or her individual views in terms of what is best for the team. Any alternative views are made to appear ill-advised or even self-serving. Fourth, the farrago has undifferentiated passion. This individual approaches every single team interaction with an intensity and devotion that far exceeds the emotional investment of others. Other team members making more moderate investments of resources are characterized as lacking commitment or not caring about the team. So you may be thinking to yourself at this point, what can we do to get out from under the constraints of this dysfunctional interaction to really achieve the positive and productive objectives of team building? Now, there are some tempting interventions whose costs outweigh benefits. One tempting intervention is bringing about a miraculous change in the farrago, or introducing a rescuer who removes the farrago. Sounds good, right? Unfortunately, this solution will be short-lived because individual habits and system properties may lead to the reemergence of the farrago. They're in the system, and removing one individual doesn't necessarily take care of it. A second tempting intervention involves changing the system properties and creating more structure. Many people say, that's all we need, more structure, more structure. Now, this may minimize the likelihood of the farrago emergence, but often such actions violate the integrity of the group and may have far-reaching constraints on creativity, motivation, and innovation. People just feel too constrained. Now, instead of these two solutions, a communication-based alternative for intervention focuses on the interactional tensions of the group and provides communicative frames which allow the team to respond as a team. This requires differentiation, where other roles besides the farrago are clarified and legitimated on a day-to-day basis. Now, this does not happen in one encounter group-like session arranged to fix the problem. An overly intense focus in one meeting on this farrago can lead to blaming, perpetuating, and even reinforcing the farrago's behavior. So what would this communication on a day-to-day basis be composed of? Well, first, you would be identifying and making explicit individual differences. In other words, we want to know what the team members' purposes are, their values, their interpretations on a day-to-day basis. Second, we would want to work to legitimate the existence of these multiple perspectives. Not only do we want to know these different perspectives, but we want to bring them into our discussion and utilize them in our decision-making process. And three, we want to distinguish and make visible to the group the dynamic that seems to be creating and reinforcing the farrago, including confronting any team member who contributes to the dynamic. In this way, the farrago's communicative profile is evoked and explicated without pointing fingers at one individual member. Now, these three activities originate from inside the group. In addition, external interventions, such as hiring an outside consultant, altering the team's supervision style, or actually changing the team's supervisor, might facilitate a positive change away from the dysfunctional dynamic of the farrago. Now, this one example of a team's dysfunctional dynamic reveals the complexity of communication, both in terms of how the dysfunction emerges and how communication functions to sustain or hopefully change the dysfunction. It also indicates how negative and dysfunctional communication patterns have far-ranging effects on the quality of work life, the quality of production, and the quality of team building. I would now like to turn our focus to a number of concepts that may help us to engage in productive team building, that may help us to avoid, counteract, or intervene when we face dysfunctional dynamics such as the farrago. Peter Senge writes in his best-selling book entitled The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of Organizational Learning, that learning is the key to an organization's life and to its overcoming its own disabilities. Now, one of the 5 disciplines is team learning. The discipline of team learning starts with dialogue, the capacity of team members to suspend their assumptions and enter into what he terms a thinking together. To the Greeks, dialogos meant a free flowing of meaning through a group, allowing the group to discover insights not attainable individually. The discipline of dialogue, according to Sengi, involves learning how to recognize patterns of interaction in teams that undermine learning. Sounds familiar? Indeed, this discipline of dialogue would certainly help team members to avoid or change the dysfunctional dynamic of the farrago. Now, the purpose of dialogue is to go beyond any one individual's understanding. We're not trying to win in dialogue. We all win if we're doing it right. In dialogue, individuals gain insights that simply could not be achieved individually. In dialogue, a team explores complex issues from many points of view. In dialogue, we become observers of our own thinking. In dialogue, we discover the collective nature of thought. There are 3 basic conditions that are necessary for dialogue. First, all participants must suspend their assumptions. Literally, we must hold them as if suspended before us. Second, all participants must regard one another as colleagues, thus maybe taking care of status differentials that can cause problems. And 3, there must be a facilitator who helps to promote dialogue. Now, once again, we see the 2 themes apparent in earlier voices. 1, advice for handling substantive, procedural, and relational problems. And 2, advice for handling the dysfunctional dynamic of the farrago. Finally, I'd like to touch on one other concept that I've been exploring in my own research on communication in organizations, one that I truly believe could facilitate team building. The concept is called organizational grace. Let me explain. I believe that the maladies that ail most contemporary organizations, including alienation, discrimination, and harassment, can be linked to divisions that are imposed on us by hierarchical imbalances, and also a disrespect for justice and a disrespect for authenticity. Inevitably, what happens is an unhealthy spirituality just permeates the organization. And this unhealthy spirituality includes dysfunctional and systematic afflictions of division, disillusionment, apathy, pretension, and dis-ease. The saving grace diminishes these ailments by inspiring a healthy spirituality. Organizational grace is acceptance. It's forgiveness. It's awareness. It's caring. Forgiveness sets us free. We extend and receive grace unconditionally. There's no restrictions or contingencies. Undeservedly. We don't earn it or merit it. It comes to us. Unexpectedly. We don't assume or demand it. Grace is extended and received not of the letter or the rule, but of the spirit. Does not follow rules, obligations, or performance. It extends from a healthy spirituality in a manner that unintentionally recognizes, rewards, and respects another person. Grace it's a philosophy of spiritual practices and rituals that are integrated and communicated in reward systems, in delegation of responsibility, and in all of our informal networks of relationships. What then are the characteristics of grace? So far in our study of organizational grace, we've come up with 4. First, mindfulness. Grace is mindfulness. In a state of mindlessness, active thinking dissipates. Information is treated in a single-minded and rigid manner, and behavior becomes automatic and repetitive. In contrast, key qualities of a mindful state include creation of new categories, openness to new information, and awareness of